My first question, of course, would be, Peter, what means deconstruction to you?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I hope I'm not here under false pretenses. I could deconstruct this whole evening by actually saying that I never used the term deconstruction, have never written it, lectured about it, or proposed that what I do has anything to do with deconstruction. However, since that it would only be 80% true, I will try and elaborate, because that's begging off. I want to start with a little anecdote which will lighten the evening a bit, I hope. And only because we are in an academic setting, and only because I happen to teach at that university in New Haven, where Jacques was very important and remains a figure of some renown. I remember when he was leaving Yale, the night he was leaving, and I had called him in the afternoon, and I said, Jacques, I know tonight's your last night, or this afternoon. Let's have dinner tonight in New York. And he said, no, I can't do that. They're having a party for me. And I said, oh, yeah, I can understand. I said, well, maybe we can do it tomorrow night. And this being the last night, and at about 8 o'clock, I got a telephone call, and it was Jacques. And he says, apparently there is no party for me. Let's have dinner. And it was both a sort of tragic and sad kind of commentary on this man who had done so much for the students, faculty, and the discipline at Yale, to leave in this kind of disappointed way. And of course, I say this because I hope, as I approach the end of my teaching at Yale, that I hope that I won't expect a party, because clearly Yale is not in the habit of giving parties. I'm also tarred with the brush of Paul Deman and Jeffrey Hartman and Jacques, especially by Harold Bloom, who was one of the sheriffs that rode the boys out of town. And Harold still feels that it's problematic that I am teaching at Yale, given my pedigree. Any case, I will say that Jacques was very important to me, and I will try and, through 3 or 4 points, answer Peter's question about architecture and Jacques' influence on architecture and deconstruction. Number one, Jacques used to say, architecture is the locus of the metaphysics of presence. And since one of Jacques' projects was the attempt to open up the problematic of metaphysics, and particularly the problematic of presence, he said that the reason he was interested in architecture and spent so much time on architecture was that it was so resistant to the project of deconstruction. And I thought for a long time that that was probably true. And then I began to ponder on it, because I always like to take and question those kinds of supposed truths. And I said, suppose architecture is not, or possibly not, the locus of the metaphysics of presence. In what way could one try and open up the discourse? And I believe to this day that I have a book that I owe Peter for about 3 years called The Architecture of the Disaster, playing on Maurice Blanchot's title, The Writing of the Disaster, and I substitute writing for architecture, which I've done on many occasions, which is, for me, the problematic of the metaphysical project, that while architecture has undertaken to clear away all of the detritus of the classical, the rule systems, the aesthetics, the social systems, the hierarchical systems that contaminated architecture, let's say, for 500 years, which was instantiated by the Renaissance to overcome the transcendental problem, to create an immanent metaphysic. It is precisely that immanent metaphysic that is not able to be eradicated up until the present time. So for me, it remains a central problematic. One of the ways that I have tried to manifest a critique of the notion of architecture as a manifestation of presence is through the relationship of the subject, the human subject, to the object architecture. And what I've tried to do in the past, in the traditional architecture, meaning and experience were part of the same thing. That is, a person walks through a building and sees a set of columns on the right side, walks, turns around, sees a set of columns on the left, and knows that it's a symmetrical building, that it's an axial building, etc., by the symmetry of right and left. So it's the experience of the project. And what we have tried to do in our work is, in fact, to suggest that the experience of the object and that is the presence in the experience, does not give you an understanding of the object. And this was very important in our work, especially in our Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, because what we said is, you can walk around this project and you don't learn anything at all. You don't know anything, you don't go anywhere, anywhere is no different than some other anywhere. And the whole idea of the project was, in fact, to reduce the meaning of experience, because I believe that's precisely what happened in the camps, the reduction of the meaning of experience, that you cannot explain in any meaningful way what the camps were intended for. And so our memorial is, in a sense, an analogy to the experience of the camps, but also an analogy to the idea of breaking down the relationship between experience and understanding. And that we, I think, have been fairly successful, although that's not something that clients want to hear, because they always say, well, what does this mean? And of course, if you say we're trying to make it mean nothing, then there's a big problem. But I mean, that gets into the politics of capital and capital needing architecture as meaningful discourse, and we're not here to discuss the relationship of capital and politics to deconstruction. The second integer that was really important for me from conversations with Jacques was the question of the possibility of the free-floating signifier as a tenet of discourse. And as we know, all architecture since Alberti, who wrote 10 books on architecture as a critique of a man called Vitruvius, who in Roman times had written 10 books on architecture, setting out the rules of discourse of the discipline. And Alberti made a critique of these rules 14 centuries later, and his major critique had to do with the Vitruvian triad: commodity, firmness, and delight. And firmness, firmitas, was about something being solid, and you needed to have something which stood up. And of course, Vitruvius didn't mean, according to Alberti, that architecture should stand up, because all architecture stands up, or it isn't architecture. It shelters, encloses, etc. He said what Vitruvius meant by firmitas was not only should architecture stand up, but it should look like it stands up. And the look like, in other words, was the signifier in the signified. And from that point on in the humanist project, the whole notion of looking like became very important. And of course, to detach this introduction of what became known as an immanent metaphysic, to detach the signifier from the sign, that is, to detach the meaning from the column, so that the column merely was a thing and that there was no necessary analogous significance, like to a tree, to a human being, to any kind of vertical, upright something. And so that was his second thing, that is that, and there are many ways to try and detach this, to double up a structural system where you know there's an excess or redundancy. And so if you look and you have two columns where you only need one, then you ask the question, well, what's the second column doing? Well, the second column is either operating half the time as a column, both operating half the time, or none of the time of the column. And if it's not acting not as a structure none of the time, what's it doing? And so the whole idea of the free-floating signifiers was another lesson learned from my misreading, let's say, of the Derridian thought.